that's not what we want. So for 6, we're starting with solving by finding square roots, okay? Basically, you use this method if there isn't a bx term, okay? And you'll see they always end up looking very similar when you use this method. So what you need to do when you're solving using square roots, you're going to square root both sides of your equation. And then just make sure when you take the square root of something, your answer should be the positive version of it and the negative version of it. Here's why. If I take the square root of 16, that could be that I did -4 times -4, or it could be that I did +4 times +4 to get 16, right? So we need to make sure that we give both the positive and the negative as our answer, which we haven't always done because sometimes we're just using square roots as an expression. When square roots come in an equation like this, something equals something, there's an equal sign involved, that's when we have to give both answers, okay? So make sure you're doing that with these. Okay, so here's your steps. Isolate your x squared, so get x squared by itself. Then we're gonna square root both sides, then give both answers as your solution. So the first one here, how would I isolate my x squared? What's my first step to get x squared by itself? Thoughts?
Get x by itself, we would subtract 147.
Yes, that's where we're gonna start. Okay, so first thing we're gonna do is take away the 147. So I get a -3x squared equals a -147. Okay, have we isolated x squared? No, we got to keep going. So my next step, divide by a -3. So I get x squared equals -147 divided by -3 is 49. Okay, so we're here now. We've isolated our x squared. What's your next step?
Square root.
Square root both sides. So we're going to say the square root of x squared and the square root of 49. Square root of x squared is x. The square root of 49 is 7, but it could also be what? -7. So you're going to write it as plus or minus 7. The positive and the negative would work there. Okay? Okay, you do B. Isolate your x squared and solve. What do you get? Thank you. What'd you get? Add 10 to both sides, right? So 7x squared equals 35. Divide by 7. X squared equals 5. What do I do next? Square root both sides, okay? Is the square root of 5 a nice number?
No.
No. So we're going to write that as plus or minus the square root of 5. If it doesn't work out to a perfect square, leave it in simplest radical form. Okay? Did you get that? And please don't forget the plus or minus. I hate having to take points off because the plus or minus isn't there, because I know if you stopped and thought about it, you would know. So do it. Just do it. That would be great. Okay, this one. We're going to add 20. So I get 2x squared equals 40. Divide by 2. So x squared equals 20. Okay, now we're going to square root both sides. So x equals plus or minus the square root of 20. Is that my final answer?
You can take the square root out.
You can simplify that, right? The square root of 20 is the square root of 4 times the square root of 5. So x equals plus or minus, that would be 2 rad 5. Okay. Okay, you do letter D. This one requires a little bit more simplifying. Don't get a decimal answer here. When you get to a point where you think, oh, that's a decimal, leave it as a fraction? You got a little more simplifying to do on this one. This is really combining your 4-7A, all that radical stuff, with solving by square rooting. Who's got an answer? You're stuck?
Yes.
Do you know where you're stuck? Did you get to x squared equals 5 over 2? 2x squared equals 5?
Yes.
Yes, so then divide by 2, right? So take away the 8. You get 2x squared equals 5. Now we divide by 2. Okay, and it's tempting here to want to call that 2.5, but don't, because we want to leave it in simplest radical form, and we're going to be square rooting. You don't square root a decimal. It's not pretty. We don't do it. So if I take the square root of both sides, did anyone finish this off? What do you get in most simple form, Michaela? Yes, the square root of 10 over 2 is one of your answers. Plus or minus, right? The negative 2. So if we simplify this, we're multiplying by the square root of 2 over the square root of 2. So up top, that's the square root of 10. The square root of 2 times the square root of 2 is just 2. So x equals plus or minus the square root of 10 over 2. Any questions on that? Does anyone else feel like that's the easiest way? I really like square rooting. Okay. Then this one, solving by completing the square. Honestly, I don't know that I ever completed a square in high school. I think my school skipped it back in the day. So when I started teaching this, I was like, oh, this is fun, something new. And it is kind of fun. I really do like completing the square, but I feel like you just have to remember the steps. You have to remember the process of getting through it. So we're going to step back a little bit and just recall, okay? That's a perfect square trinomial. Remember perfect square trinomials? You did it on the test, perfect square trinomial. What does that become when we factor it? 2x, right? We square root this, we square root that, that's a 5, and we keep the symbol. So it's 2x minus 5 squared, okay? So a perfect square trinomial gets us a binomial squared, right? Okay, so there's a few parts to completing the square. We're gonna just do a little bit of recap, and then we'll put all of that together to actually do the process of completing the square. Completing the square meaning you have a perfect square trinomial, right? Complete the perfect square. Make it a perfect square trinomial so that life becomes easier. So starting with our letter A here, okay? If I have x squared plus 4x plus 4, if I factor the left side there, what does that become? Just like we did right up here, right? This was a perfect square trinomial. This is a perfect square trinomial. How does that factor?
X plus 2.
X plus 2 squared, right? So you have x plus 2 squared equals 25. Okay, now if I want to solve that, something squared equals 25. When that something over here is a perfect square, I could square root both sides, right? Just like we did in the last stuff, solve by square rooting. I could square root both sides, and I would end up with x plus 2 equals what?
5.
Or negative 5, right? Equals plus or minus 5, okay? Now that I just solved by saying x plus 2 equals 5. and x plus 2 equals negative 5, right? Those are my two equations to solve because it's equal to the plus or the minus. So if I take away 2, I get x equals 3. If I take away 2 here, I get x equals negative 7. Okay? So there's that setup. If I have a perfect square trinomial and I have something on the other side and I take the square root of both, those are still equal parts. Okay? That's a part of completing the square. Another part of completing the square is this. And this formula, you guys, it's going to be your best friend in this lesson. You're going to use it on every one of these problems. And you may think of it as 1/2 times b and then square it, or you can think of it as b divided by 2 and then square it. I don't care which one you do. I feel like I typically veer toward that one. I don't know why. I just do. But they're the same thing, right? B over 2 or 1/2 times b is really the same thing. So make sure you memorize that formula and you use it when you're completing the square, okay? So here's what you do. If we want to complete the square, we want to get a perfect square trinomial in our problem. If I have these numbers and I'm trying to get a perfect square trinomial, I need to figure out what perfect square goes right here. The way we do that is with that formula. So I'm going to do 1/2 of b. What is b? 6, right? 1/2 of 6, and I'm going to square it, or 6 divided by 2 squared, if you like that better. Okay? What do you get when you do that? 9. That is your perfect square. That makes your perfect square trinomial. Okay? So look at letter C here. We're going to do 1/2 of 18 squared. Now, technically, you guys, it is a negative 18, but when you square a negative, it always becomes positive. So I don't care if you make it a negative 18 or a positive 18. When you square it, it's positive anyway. So that's up to you how you want to write that out. What do you get for your setup here? 1/2 of negative 18 would be negative 9, and negative 9 squared is 81. Okay, so look at these two so far. If I factored this, what is that now? Something squared, right? Your symbol here would be a plus. What goes in the first blank? X. What goes in the second? 3. So this factors to x plus 3 squared because we made it a perfect square trinomial. What would this one factor to?
X minus 9.
Take the square root of x squared, the square root of 81, and your symbol here stays put. So x minus 9 squared. Okay? Okay, so look at letter D. Complete the square for me by finding, well, start the process of completing the square. Find your perfect square. What goes in that blank? And then once you find that, factor it for me. Okay, try letter D there. And when I say try letter D, it doesn't mean just sit around and wait for me to do it for you. I want you to actually try it. Give it a go. I believe in you. You can do it. What number did you put in the box?
49.
49, yes. That should be 49. So it's 1/2 of negative 14, and we're squaring that number. So negative 7 squared is a positive 49. This is always going to be positive, right? When you square a negative, it's always a positive number. So you will always have a plus in your formula right there. What does that factor to? X minus, because of this minus right here, x minus 7 squared, right? Square root this, Square root that, that's x minus 7 squared. Okay, so we have all those ideas now. We're going to put it all together, and we're going to complete the square. And I gave you the steps of it off to the side here. You start by moving the constant to the other side of your equation. Then you figure out what 1/2 b squared is, and you add it to both sides of your equation so that we aren't just adding something to one side of the equation. You'll factor it, you take the plus or minus square root of it, and then you can solve for x. Okay, so it's kind of a long process, but I feel like once you get in the groove of it, it's pretty straightforward. Okay, so here's the deal. Your constant right now in this letter A, the constant they're talking about is that plus 5. We want to complete the square. Right now, this is not a perfect square trinomial, right? 5 is not a perfect square. So we want to make it a perfect square. So what we're going to do is we're going to get the 5 out of there. So take away 5 from both sides, and we're just going to leave a blank there. Okay, so this is your step 1. Move the constant to the other side. You get x squared plus 6x plus something, some perfect square, will equal 7. Okay, now your perfect square, we're trying to find the perfect square. Do you remember how to do that? How to find what goes here?
The formula that was on
The formula, 1/2 b squared, right? So now we're going to go 1/2 of 6, and we're going to square it. 1/2 of 6 is 3. 3 squared is 9. Okay, so here's the deal. Think about what we just did. On that left side of our equation, we added 9 to the left side. Are you allowed to do something to one side of an equation without doing it to the other in algebra? It's the golden rule of algebra, right? Whatever you do to one side, you have to do it to the other side. So your step 2 is to add that 9 to both sides. Okay. So we added 9 on the left, we added 9 on the right. Technically, the simplest form of that then is x squared plus 6x. Actually, you know what? I'm not going to write that again. We're going to do this in one shot. We're going to factor it and simplify together. Step 3, how does this factor?
x plus 3 squared.
Yep, this is a plus, so this is a plus, right? The square root here and the square root here, so we get x plus 3 squared equals what on the right side?
16.
16. Add these together. Okay, so now we've factored it. Once you factor it, you do the plus or minus square root, step 4 here. So I'm going to square root both sides, right? That means on the left, I get x plus 3, because the square root is going to take the squared away, equals, don't forget your plus or minus here, plus or minus the square root of 16, which is 4. Okay, last step is solve for x. So that means x plus 3 equals 4, and it means x plus 3 equals negative 4. So take away the 3, and you get x equals 1. Take away the 3, and you get x equals negative 7. That's your process. You just completed the square. It's a lot of steps, yeah. But it is very like, you do the same thing over and over and over again. So the more exposure you have to it, the easier it's gonna be. Okay, I'm gonna do letter B with you, and then I'm gonna have you try letter C on your own. And then guys, we're done. You have the rest of the class period to work on the homework, because it didn't work out for us to review and take the quiz Friday with how things rolled. So we were like, we're just gonna have a pretty chill day on that block day. So we have a pretty chill block today. Short lesson, well, not a short lesson, but one lesson, and then lots of time to work. Okay, so letter B here. thinking through your steps, right? Here's all your steps. Maybe just have that in front of you as you're doing the homework. 5 steps that you need to do. Step 1, add 3. You're going to move the constant over. So add 3 and add 3. That means you have x squared minus 10x plus something, right? Don't forget to leave your blank there, equals 4. Complete that square for me. What is that perfect square trinomial going to be? 25. You're doing 1/2 times -10, and you're squaring it. Okay, so that's a -5 squared is 25. So add the 25 on the left side and add the 25 on the right side. I feel like that's a step that gets forgotten a lot. So make sure when you add the 25 that you're adding it to both sides, because that's an easy one to just forget. It's the golden rule of algebra. Whatever you do to one side, you have to do to the other. Okay, what do you do next? It's what? What do you do to this first? Yeah, Chris?
Factor it.
You have to factor it. Okay, so once you get a perfect square trinomial, factor that perfect square trinomial. So this is going to be x plus or minus? Minus because of this guy, right? So the square root of x squared is x. The square root of 25 is 5. So x minus 5 squared equals what?
25.
No, 29, right? The 4 that we moved over, well, we moved the 3 over. The 4 plus the 25. So this is 29. Now what? Now you square root both sides. So we're going to square root here, and we're going to square root here. What happens when you square root? If we're going to square root both sides, your answer needs to have what? Plus or minus. Actually, you don't need parentheses anymore. So this would be x minus 5 on the left. Don't forget the plus or minus. Square root of 29 is not a lovely number, so we're going to leave it as the square root of 29. And now we just solve for x. So you have 2 equations here. X minus 5 equals the square root of 29. And x minus 5 equals the negative square root of 29. And solve it. So if I add 5 and I add 5, here's the deal. The format that you want to do this in, you always put the radical at the end. So if I'm doing this is going to be x equals 5 plus the square root of 29. This one's going to be x equals 5 minus the square root of 29. I don't care if you leave your answer like this, but a simpler answer would just be x equals 5 plus or minus the square root of 29. So that would be your best answer. But it is fine if you want to just leave them as 2 separate things. I don't have any problem with that. Yeah. You can either do this as your final answer, or if you want to put it together, then you can write it that way. You can't add the 5. Yeah, you can't add a 5 to a radical, right? One's a radical, one is not, so you have to just leave it like that. And there's no like simplifying of rad 29, so that is what it is. Okay, I want you to try one on your own. And this is probably the hardest one. There's a little more simplifying that comes into it. So take your time, work through it. We'll walk through it in just a minute once you're good and done. Let's finish this one up just to make sure everyone's good to go. So first thing you did was subtract the 1, right? X squared plus 8x plus something equals 4. What did you get for this number? Yeah, half of 8 and square that. So 4 squared is 16, but make sure you add it to both sides. So now if we factor x squared plus 8x plus 16, that factors to x plus 4 squared. And then 4 plus 16 is 20. What do you do next? Square root both sides. So you get x plus 4, right? The square root just takes away the squared. Nothing else changes. Numbers don't change at all. Equals the square root of 20. We can break that down into what? Square root of 4 and the square root of 5. Don't forget your plus or minus here, right? When you square root 20, it should be plus or minus. So that would be 2 rad 5 equals x plus 4. So here's the deal. You can set it up as two separate equations right now, but really you're taking away 4 from the x to isolate the x. So if you just think of it as minus 4 here, it's x equals a negative 4 plus or minus 2 rad 5. So you don't technically have to set it up as the two separate equations. On both of them, you would be subtracting 4. So if you want to just do it like that, I'm fine with that. Just try to make sure that you're putting your integer first and then your radical behind it. Some of you tried to combine these, negative 4 plus 2 and negative 4 minus 2. Why can't we do that? Do you know? That 2 has to get multiplied by the rad 4 first before we add or subtract to it. And we can't multiply by the rad 5 and get a nice number. So you have to just leave it in its simplest form, which is actually that one, negative 4 plus or minus 2 rad 5. Any questions on that? Okay.